happy to share. I haven't known Elizabeth for a very long time, but I have teachers that were at my school in Washington, D.C., Zara Majid for one, who have known her for many, many years. Elizabeth was, when I met her, at the National Center for Montessori in the public sector. And last year, I had an opportunity to attend the course on coaching. And Elizabeth was instrumental in developing that at such a deep level of understanding of human development and what really adults need in order to be able to help guide them forward. So it was a great time to be with her. And I also brought her a gift, which she happens to have with her from long ago. I collected those, and I just brought one with me to the class for her. So now she has begun her new organization, and I know she'll share all of this with you. She's a very special person. So Elizabeth.
Thank you, Gussie. I am so happy to be here with all of you and to have gone back and listened to some amazing conversations. And I'm so happy to have a conversation with you today. I want to start with my origin story because I'm had a chance to be with Mirka at the Montessori Everywhere. We did a pandemic cafe together. And when we met after that, she said, "Where did you come from?" And so I thought, well, I should probably say where I came from at the start of this. The start of my Montessori journey started in Washington, D.C., when I did my elementary training with Miss Margaret Stevenson, when the Washington Montessori Institute was in DuPont Circle. Couldn't find any good pictures of that on the internet, so we'll have to live with a picture of Washington, D.C. And from there, I went and worked at a school in Westminster, Maryland, on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland in a rural community. And I taught a 6 to 12 class right out of training. And if it wasn't for the head of school, who was my very first Montessori coach, I'm not sure I would have become the practitioner I became, because she invited me every week to reflect on practice. So trying to figure out how to implement all the amazing things I had learned over the year really was supported by her encouragement to reflect on practice. And then family situation, my dad passed and my mom was losing her leg to cancer. So I left that precious school and I returned home and I landed at the Children's Montessori School in Ipswich, Massachusetts, which was another parent-teacher co-op, as was the Montessori School of Westminster at the time. It was in a church basement, as you can see from the photo. Now they have an actual school. And I spent almost a decade at Children's Montessori School growing my practice. It was a brand new co-op and they only had 6-year-olds there. And so I got to grow an elementary program. And I got to travel with children. I did lower elementary and then I traveled with a group and did an upper elementary class. And it was an amazing trajectory to go through the whole curriculum and the whole cycle. And I was observed at Children's Montessori School by some people from Springfield, where they were starting the very first public Montessori program. And the school on the left is Zanetti, and that was the first public Montessori school that opened in Massachusetts right before the Tobin, which is in Cambridge. And the principal recruited me in the middle of their first year. It opened in 1999, and they had started with 6 weeks of training. And by January, she called me up and said, "Can you please come and help our teachers?" And it had been a school that had been a full-on traditional school the year before. It was actually a school that children were enrolled in if no adult in their life enrolled them in any other school in the city. So it had a high number of children in foster care or with incarcerated parents. And they left school in June as a traditional school, and they walked back in the fall, and it was a Montessori school. I'll never forget a child in upper elementary telling her teacher that her teacher was in the wrong classroom. And she said, the teacher Rebecca said back to, why do you say that? And she said, "You're too nice to be a 5th grade teacher. You must be a 1st grade teacher. You're too nice to be a 5th grade teacher." So that was like the, enculturation of bringing a Montessori program into was amazing. And I was able to do that work 5 years as the wait list grew. And the then superintendent asked the principal to start a 2nd public Montessori program on the other side of the city in the poorest neighborhood in our state, at Harena Community School. And so she asked if I would go with her and help build that program. During that time, I was fortunate enough, as the teachers were being trained, it was again going to be a flip model where it ended as one day and it opened up the next. And so converting 80 teachers from traditional teachers into Montessori teachers. These are not methods I recommend, by the way. This was a pretty tricky way to do it. But through that, I took my primary training with the primary teachers and simultaneously did my Montessori administrative training with the Center for Contemporary Montessori Programs, while I was also doing my state certification. A bunch of us had decided that what will keep Montessori strong in the public sector is if we have enough Montessori trained administrators. And so there were a number of us that went through that process. I thought that was a great idea. Unfortunately, the new superintendent who came, and we were all administrative credentialed, reorganized us and moved all the Montessori leadership into other public Montessori programs. We were all transferred, and non-Montessori leaders were put into the 2 public Montessori schools, which was my exit to Hartford Public Schools. And that's where I met Jackie Cosentino. Upper left is Crack Montessori Magnet School. And she was the head of that school at the time and brought me on to bring child study process there. And then she generously shared the word with Moylan Montessori and Annie Fisher Montessori about child study. And I ended up settling at Annie Fisher for 5 years, where I worked for the first time with a Montessori trained leader of the school, John Freeman. And that was an extraordinary experience. And Uma Ramani, who's a primary trainer, did some weekly coaching there. And the 3 of us had so much fun developing a lot of strong practices to support public Montessori. And from there, I was recruited by Keith and Jackie, who had then started the National Center for Montessori in the public sector, and invited me to come on board and bring coaching to the national platform. And so developed and spread Montessori coaching across many schools. And I was working at the National Center when we all abruptly fell into school closures. And so had the opportunity to walk through those early days with a lot of school communities as they were all figuring out how to manage what they were being asked to do. Such incredible resilience on the part of so many people. And just this past summer, in fact, today is the 3-month anniversary of Public Montessori in Action. 2 of my colleagues, Allison Jones and Michelle Boyle, and I, 3 months ago today, launched Public Montessori in Action, which is looking at a global frame, not just on the national, but our mission is to bring and ensure fully implemented Montessori for children, families, and educators of the global majority. So looking to really widen and strengthen what we're offering to ensure that every child, all children, have access to strong Montessori. And then experimenting with how can we create the same diversity and strong Montessori within our own organization. Everyone tells me, you can't have an organization that's based like Montessori. And I said, it's my whole life. It's all I know. I'm going to give it a whirl. Let's see what happens if we have it be structured as a Montessori organization. So stay tuned. We're only 3 months old. I'll let you know how that goes. But our main underlying goal here is to build resilient schools for human flourishing. Too often, schools will come and go on the landscape, and we're looking to create some resilience so they're lasting, because the people who are most impacted when schools flip or change or close are the children of that community. And so wanting to ensure 3-year cycles and a strong experience for the world's children. And this is our public Montessori in action quotation. And thanks to Kathy, whenever we read a quotation by Dr. Montessori, she is with us in the room. Kathy, I really wish you'd been with me when on her birthday, because she had a birthday hat for that entire day. It was quite festive. Yeah. Anyway, this is education understood as a help to life, an education from birth which feeds a peaceful revolution and unites all in a common aim, attracting them as to a single center. So this quotation is really about developing community of practice, which Lead Montessori and Mirka, everyone is really doing, is how can we have this peaceful revolution where we're united together as a single center, and we're not broken down by training backgrounds or organization allegiances, but we're all centered with our common aim. So that's one of the pieces we hold near and dear. So some of our early work has been developing this idea of Montessori for a new world. So having the opportunity last spring to walk with many educators into this new world. And that was, I think, even before everyone was aware that it was our new world. I don't know if people got to hear the last conversation that happened in June that was with Mark and Judith, called The Shape of What Comes Next. If you haven't already heard that conversation, it's recorded. It's great. It's such a fantastic one, where their first point is that if you're waiting to get back to January 2020, it's time to stop waiting for that, right? That is of the past. But I think initially, people were thinking of this as very temporary. And I got to listen also, Letty, to your talk, where you talk about the distinction between virtual learning and distance learning, that we're hoping that children are learning at a distance still in their Montessori way. And so building off of that. And I had the opportunity to collaborate with 2 people who did distance learning in the spring, Don Bradley, who is a primary teacher at Libertas School of Memphis, and Melissa McLean, who is an elementary teacher who works at Elm City in New Haven, Connecticut. So the 3 of us got together. I had a chance to observe a number of spring lessons to start to see and understand what is our new world. Montessori always reminds us that is our first go-to, is first we observe, first we see what's happening. And Madalena also talked about that in her talk. She was talking about how we open with live children in smaller groups, but she pointed us back to observation, right? So I got to observe a number of lessons, and then we put together this Montessori for a New World. Whenever I do professional development or work with people, I remember from my Massachusetts administrative license course, I had to take a course on professional development that really stayed with me. And the person said, be clear what the people are going to be able to know and be able to do by the end of their time with you, which is so meaningful. I went to so much professional development in Springfield public schools and Hartford, a little less so in Hartford, where I didn't know what I was supposed to know or what I was supposed to be able to do by the end of it. I felt utterly bewildered, and that was really skillful to think. So these are the things we're hoping that people know and are able to do after they've done some New World learning with us. And then we open with this quotation, which, Kathy, can you see it? And would you be willing to read it while I hold up Dr. Montessori?
Yes, okay. So I give very few lessons on how to give lessons, least my suggestions, becoming stereotypes and parodied, should turn into obstacles instead of help. the directress is dealing with different personalities, and it therefore becomes more a question of how she should orient herself in what is for her a new world, rather than any rigid absolute rules. Maria Montessori.
So that's our permission giving slide, where we remember as a Montessori community that our task is to orient ourselves to what is for us a new world, rather than sticking to any rigid absolute rules from the past, from January 2020 and prior. We had some ideas of how this was going to go. And so part of this is bringing in some adaptive and flexible thinking to this, and to know that Dr. Montessori herself would have suggested just that, that we are orienting to a new world. And so we begin, as Magdalena talked in her talk, by thinking about our parts of our triangle, right? And so what are our elements that we're thinking about? Also, when we're thinking about the whole child, we're thinking about something in child study that we use, a lens for looking to support key children, is sort of the lens of the base. So at the base is behavior, what impacts children's behavior; academics, what impacts their ability to learn; social, what impacts their ability to make strong social connections; and emotionally, what impacts them emotionally. So we took that lens and we combined it with the lens of human tendencies. So we broke it into three parts. So our New World teaching components has sort of the prepared environment, where we're thinking about that, the prepared adult, and then we're thinking about the whole child. And through those, we're going to remember human tendencies that sort of map onto each of those. So when we're learning and thinking about our new prepared environment, we're thinking about orientation, order, and exactness. And when we're visiting the part about delivering strong Montessori lessons, then we're thinking about work, repetition, activity, and manipulation. And then when we're thinking about how is this impacting our children, and what are the things we want to remember, we're thinking about self-perfection, exploration, and communication. So those are two lenses that we offer when we're thinking about how we're adapting. So the first part is thinking about planning and preparing. So Mirka, would you read this next quotation? These are the people I can see on my screen, so they'll be the lucky readers.
Yes. Freedom without organization of work would be useless. The child left free without means of work would go to waste, just as a newborn baby, if left free without nourishment, would die of starvation. The organization of the work, therefore, is the cornerstone of this new structure of goodness in education. But even that organization would be in vain without the liberty to make use of it.
So here's where we remember how important it is that we have some organization, so that people can be free. So we're also thinking how much that helps children with behavior. So we go through these things. First thing we do, though, is we pull back and we recognize that when non-Montessori people observe Montessori classrooms, they just are amazed. How does this work? How do the children know what to do? There's no bells, no one's barking, telling them what to do. There's no one's even flashing the lights. How is this happening? That our structures in our regular Montessori classroom are fairly invisible. And so how do we make them more visible, especially for practitioners that have been doing this for a long time, is that we go through and we think about what were the procedures and routines and what do they need to be now? You knew them in the classroom. Let's establish what they are now. Same thing with grace and courtesy. What were our grace and courtesy expectations then? How do we adjust them to the now? And then expectations, that we don't use punishments and rewards as ways of having people do what needs to be done. We do it because it's expected. For the young child, it's the adult expectations, and for the older children, it's the community expectations that are driving what's happening. And then we talk in that part too about the partnership that we're having with families now, that they are part of the puzzle that we are trying to put together, and how important it is to have high communication and a strong orientation going into this next school year. The last school year, none of us were oriented. We had no ability to create order there. We were, sort of building the planes, we were flying it, but taking the summer and taking some intentional steps. How might we talk to families about procedures and routines, grace and courtesy, and what are the expectations for this new way of learning and being together? And then we talk a little bit about key children. So key children is a term from child study, which is talking about all of those sort of potentially atypical learners in our classroom. And so that could be anything from a big personality to somebody with some learning challenges. If you're interested more in key children, I just had a great conversation on the Montessori in Action podcast with 2 practitioners who work with key children, talking about them in general, and also talking about during this New World Learning time, how the key children are doing. But we need to turn our mind just the way we did in the classroom. We had to think deeply about how our environment was serving our key children, so that there are no achievement gaps and there's no disparity in what children are experiencing. And so what's our lens on that now? So that's a piece that we talk about. And then we realize that when we're doing a puzzle and we've created a frame, we always feel much more confident. As soon as I have the outside, I feel like, okay, I can do it. So if we have procedures and routines, grace and courtesy, and clear expectations as a school that we share, just the way we did when we were in school, then we have a stronger frame. And so helping schools develop those so that it's common. If a family has 3 children, they all have the same procedures and routines, grace and courtesy, and clear expectations. It's not such variation from teacher to teacher or classroom to classroom or level to level. So then we talk a little bit about the lesson. And this is going to then bounce back to you, Kathy, as one of the only 2 people I can see. I wonder if you'll read this next quotation.
Okay, spontaneous activity in education. Our care of the child should be governed not by the desire to make him learn things, but by the endeavor always to keep burning within him that light, which is called the intelligence.
So this is our reminder that kicks off a whole section on how we're going to do strong Montessori now. And I love what Mark and Judith brought up in their talk. Point number 4 was about agility. And it was about, they used the term pedagogical resilience. And so I love that. I'm going to start adding that in the ways that we're thinking about how we're going to have some resilience for our pedagogy in these areas. And so thinking about how we bring our Montessori mindset, all these pieces are part of our puzzle, and how do we incorporate those? And we have some tools. There's tools throughout this whole piece. And I had shared with Mirka the bundle of tools that people can use as checklists to start to understand, am I holding on to the mainframe? And then Dawn then gives a primary lesson using the computer about the continents, and very sort of skillfully shows that. And then Melissa does a lesson about the snake game without the bead bars to show how that might be done. So taking 2 lessons and talking about, we talk in there a little bit about the difference between impressionistic materials, which for an example would be the globe, which when Dawn is doing the continent lesson, she'll show the globe, as opposed to showing a puzzle map. One of my observations in the spring when I was observing a classroom is I watched an absolutely beautiful lesson occur. It should have been filmed for a training video, but none of the children were engaged. And I realized that it was because they weren't going to get a turn to touch the materials. It was a bead chain lesson, and they basically said at the end, like, well, I'm not going to get to do that. And I realized that part of our children's like pure fascination is I'm just about to have my turn. I'm watching your every move because I'm going to get to put this binomial cube together myself. And that now in this new world, we need to adjust that so that we're not creating that false tension, but that we're using impressionistic lesson materials to link to the classroom, but that we're creating materials that children can use in their home environment. So that this is a whole section on how we're doing that, then sort of bring the pieces, the puzzle pieces together. And then our last section is about holding the whole child. So this bumps back to you, Mirka. I think this might be our last one.
I love how you put up the portrait. I've never seen that done before, and I'm totally gonna copy this.
Get it from Kathy. Kathy can hook you up.
Okay, it's so cool. All right, International Montessori Congress, 1937. Do we believe and constantly insist that cooperation among the peoples of the world is necessary in order to bring about peace? If so, what is needed, first of all, is collaboration with children. All of our efforts will come to nothing until we remedy the great injustice done the child, and remedy it by cooperating with him. If we are among the men of goodwill who yearn for peace, we must lay the foundation for peace ourselves by working for the social world out of the child.
So this is the part where we try to follow through with those words by talking about the social emotional world of the child. And we go through these different components, talking about relationship building at the core of our Montessori work. And both Slade and Magdalena mentioned this in their talks as well, about how we're transferring that now, how we're not dropping, and we can't have a relationship now, but yet we're using the same elements. So we talk about how that works. We talk about the importance for the child to connect with themselves, for them to connect with their friends, and for them to connect with the wider community, and what are ways that's happening across the world. And then we talk a bit about self-care, because as was brought up in Mark and Judith's talk, the boundaryless nature of this new world makes it no distinction. You can't drive away and come home and be like, whew, I'm home. I'm no longer thinking about that. So how are we caring for ourselves during this time? And then there's a fair piece about equity, because what happened as we shifted into this new way of being together is that initially there was a slide, and inequitable things were happening based on adults' own ability to flex with what was happening. So some teachers who were young and single and tech savvy were spending 20 hours a day and creating amazing things for their children, and other teachers who'd been doing in-person Montessori for 20 years, or people who were parents who had small children at home weren't able to create or be there at that level. And so we had this inequity happen across schools. And so how are we bringing that back? What are our elements that are going to create some equity that all of our children are being reached during this time? And I have gone on perhaps longer than my allotted time, but this is where we get to now have our community conversation instead of just me talking. And thank you all so much. Appreciate everyone being here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I wasn't sure whether you were going to go through you were going to be able to go through all of that. That was so much that you just so much work put into that. It's incredible.